Once again, Shabbat Shalom. It's wonderful to be out here with all of you. Here's a riddle. You're a bus driver. Pay close attention. At the first stop, 5 people get on. At the second stop, 2 people get off and 4 people get on. At the next stop, 1 gets on with twins in a double stroller. At the 4th stop, 7 people get on, it's by the university, and 6 get off. What's the bus driver's name? This has absolutely nothing to do with my Devar Torah, except I suppose that we are in the book of Numbers, and it has to do with a bus. Now, for real. Imagine you are on a bus or the train, and a mob of passengers gets on, their faces covered by keffiyas. The leader shouts, "Raise your hand if you're a Zionist." And his followers all repeat, "Raise your hand if you're a Zionist." The chant goes on for a few rounds until the leader says, "Raise your hand if you're a Zionist. This is your chance to get off." And the mob follows. And the cycle starts over. What would you do? I don't know what I would do, so I'm glad I wasn't on the subway at 14th Street in Manhattan when this happened on Monday. After an anti-Israel rally outside of the memorial for the Nova Music Festival, where people chanted, "Go to hell, Israel," and held banners that read, "Long live October 7th and Intifada forever," a mob of masked, keffiyah-clad people got onto the subway and chanted over and over, "Raise your hand if you're a Zionist." Obviously, nobody raised their hand, and the leader finally said, "No Zionists here, we're good." This might lead one to ask whether saying no Zionists is code for no Jews, whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And some would say an unequivocal yes, and others would say an equally unequivocal no. And the conversation would be uncomfortable and morph, perhaps, into a more uncomfortable conversation about the war and the encampments, and words like colonialism and genocide will be triggering and cause more discomfort until the conversation becomes antagonistic and drives wedges into relationships. Oy. The polarization which has marked American politics in the last few years is now rearing its ugly head in our Jewish community and beyond when it comes to Israel. It's as if one can't support Israel's right to exist and defend herself without being accused of supporting apartheid or genocide. It's as if one can't criticize Israel's government or be sympathetic to the plight of the Palestinians suffering in Gaza without being accused of anti-Semitism or of supporting Hamas. Although this isn't really new. Back in 2018, during the week of Parshat Naso, which is the same week in the Torah reading calendar as today, Rabbi Jill Jacobs published a piece in the Washington Post entitled, "How to Tell When Criticism of Israel is Actually Anti-Semitism." Rabbi Jacobs wrote, "Yes, anti-Semitism is alive and well, and increasingly it masquerades as criticism of Israel. But as the executive director of Teruah, a Jewish organization dedicated to protecting human rights here in Israel and in the occupied territories, I know it's possible to criticize Israel without veering into anti-Semitism. I do it every day." Fast forward to from Parshat Naso 2018 to Parshat Naso 2024. I too know it's possible to criticize Israel without veering into anti-Semitism. And I know it is possible to have compassion for Palestinian suffering without veering into anti-Zionism or supporting terrorism. I do it every day. And yet it seems more and more common for people to be going off the rails, veering dangerously from criticism into hate, and even from compassion to hate. And that, I think, is where we should focus our attention And ask not whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, but whether what is being espoused by either side is meaningful ideology with the intent to create positive change, or is it simply hate, which can only lead to more hate? I would like to think that nobody in our communities would ever devolve from protest to hate, but the truth is, it's a fine line and a slippery slope, a very slippery slope, especially when one can hide behind a mask, a crowd, an encampment, or social media. Let's go back to 2018 again and Rabbi Jill Jacobs' piece in the Washington Post. I know it's possible to criticize Israel without veering into anti-Semitism. I do it every day. But I also see plenty of criticism that crosses the line. Jews increasingly feel unwelcome on the left unless they abandon their commitments to Israel. At the University of Virginia, progressive campus groups responded to neo-Nazi incursions by dismissing Jewish students as Zionist baby killers. At rallies on college campuses, now this is 2018, at rallies at college campuses, speakers regularly list Zionists in the same category as white supremacists and Nazis. Progressive leaders circulate lists of acceptable Jewish organizations, including only those that define themselves as Palestinian solidarity groups or do not address Israel at all. If the left, she says, if the left continues to ignore this trend, most of the Jewish community will be pushed out of progressive spaces. This, remember, was 6 years ago, in the before times, before October 7th, before Israel's response. I think Rabbi Jacobs had it right, and her warning is even more salient now. I just heard today on NPR that nationwide violence has gone way, way down, but anti-Semitism is up 300%. Which brings me back to now, and this week's Torah portion, not so. There's 3 passages in our Torah portion which I think can give us guidance and help keep us grounded in these troubles and divisive times. One is from Numbers chapter 4, one from chapter 5, and one from chapter 6. Numbers 4:21. It's the opening verse of our parsha. It begins, Naso et Rosh, literally lift up their heads. In the context of the chapter, it means take a census. But in our context, it can remind us to lift up our heads as proud Jews, be counted on to speak out against hate. And it can remind us to use our heads when our hearts might lead us to close our minds and draw us close to the edge of that slippery slope from ideology to antagonism to hatred. In chapter 5, verse 6, we read, when a man or a woman commits any wrong toward a fellow human being, thus breaking faith with God, and they realize their guilt, they shall confess the wrong they have done. They shall make restitution and add 1/5 to it, giving it to the one who was wronged. In other words, accountability and repentance aren't just for Yom Kippur. When our ideologies make us lose our heads or risk destroying our relationships, we need to hold ourselves accountable for the words we use and apologize and make emotional restitution, and then some, when we do go off the rails. And lastly, in chapter 6, verse 23, we have what we call the priestly benediction, the one I say at the end of every Shabbat service. Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'yichuneka, Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. May God bless you and keep you or guard you. May God shine God's light on you and be gracious unto you. May God turn God's face towards you and bring you peace. Rabbi Hannah Spiro finds it curious that in this blessing, God can turn God's face in one direction or another, as though God isn't always and everywhere, turned in every direction all at once. It's counterintuitive, she says, that God could be facing one direction and not another, not to mention God having a face at all. Unless, she says, unless we're actually talking not about God, but about the image of God, Tselem Elohim, that is, us, people. We turn our attention in different directions all the time. Rabbi Spiro suggests that we understand this blessing as what we can do for each other in divisive times like these. We have an ancient tradition of interpretation called Targum. In the first century, sages would simultaneously translate the Hebrew text of the Torah into the vernacular, which was Aramaic. But they didn't just translate word for word. They translated word for interpretation, and included just in their translation, in air quotes, lots of interpretation. And we have the record of that. It's called the Targum. So Rabbi Spiro offers this Targum for the priestly benediction. Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. May God bless us and keep us vigilant, looking out for ourselves and our people. Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'chuneka. May God inspire us to light up, proudly highlighting our own beauty, and allow us to be gracious even when folks make it hard. Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. May God inspire us to turn our faces toward others, across neighborhoods, across ideologies, across religions, across borders, and really try to see with compassion what's going on there, so we may increase peace rather than decrease it. Rabbi Spiro's Targum of the priestly blessing honors the need to speak out against hate speech targeting our people, to speak up for ourselves with pride for who we are, and to speak with honesty about how we can do better. It calls on us to turn toward one another with graciousness and figure out where the ones who hurt us are coming from. By turning towards each other rather than away, by listening to each other with curiosity rather than animosity, we may slow that slippery slide that ends in hate. And when cruel and hateful words make us want to turn away in fear, this ancient blessing can encourage us to respond with courage, to speak out with clarity, and even then, try to listen. Even when it stings, may we be blessed with the power to seek peace. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may it be God's will.